Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 30th of July. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with our very latest weather information, whether that's through your NOAA weather radio or through the internet, weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. Give us a call on the weather info line if you haven't yet, 800-472-0391. Find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. And some things to check out on Facebook and YouTube if you haven't recently. Noctilucent clouds. Have you ever seen those before? I've never seen them before, but I got a glimpse of them on our social media pages today. Out over King Salmon using the FAA weather cameras. We caught sight of those during the early morning hours of this morning. So after the show, go over there and check that out. If you go to YouTube, you can type in NWS Anchorage, or if you go to Facebook, just go to NWS Alaska in your search bar and you'll find that imagery there. Pretty cool stuff. Here's a look at the fire danger now, and as expected with some drier weather settling in, it's not really much of a surprise then that a few more spots have reached back into that high fire danger. Though it's pretty isolated, those are areas that could see some maybe accelerated burning if something were to get started, and that's not the case right now. Here's a look out at the Bering Sea. And once again, our blocking pattern in the upper atmosphere is shutting down any Pacific moisture from making it into the Gulf. Instead, we're traversing the Bering Sea with that moisture and any storms coming up the western side and then dropping back down. And as they drop back down, they're drying out. However, they're also pulling in some colder air moving in through the Chukchi Seacoast. And in one different case, in this case, we've got a little batch of moisture that's made its way through the Bering and is going to start moving from west to east into the west coast of Alaska. And following that will be another round of colder and drier air. You'll see that in the forecast maps in a minute. Looking at the state of Alaska, you can see the visible satellite picture is showing two major features, I think. One of them being the low pressure system swirling Pacific moisture northward into the clouds, but that is running into the second main feature, which is a lot of dry air sweeping down across the Yukon Valley, southwestern Alaska, and back into the North Pacific. So that's just chewing into this edge of moisture, trying to work its way back to the west and north. Now, Southeast enjoyed a little bit of a drier day today. Hopefully you thought it was nice. If you're in Southeast, you'll have to let me know. Out across the western coast of Alaska, more clouds are building in with that moisture plume that's coming in across the ridge of high pressure. As you'll see, this is slowly working its way back toward the Seward Peninsula, and with that comes a better chance of rain. And then finally, after that, we'll see that return of colder weather across the north and west. Our surface weather chart shows a weak stationary boundary pretty much along the spine of the Alaska Range all the way into the Yukon. And way out to the east, we saw a whole line of thunderstorms firing up across the eastern Yukon and the Northwest Territories today. A few more storms were firing up a little bit closer to home in the central Yukon. And then there's a possibility of some growing clouds and maybe a few thunderclaps later on tonight for south central and perhaps southeastern sections of the Copper River Basin and the interior. Again, it's kind of an outside chance, but it is pretty warm out there. The problem is the atmospheric setup's not quite right to make it a bigger show than what we saw last night. Out across the west, just to the west of the Seward Peninsula, there are some areas of light rainfall, and you can see a frontal boundary working into the far western chain. Keep your eye on that. Unless you're really looking for something exciting, you're not going to find it there. It looks like that's probably going to fall apart. Winds may pick up a little bit. Could be a little breezy at times, so probably be some light rain, but over the next 24 to 36 hours, that it should be falling apart there and barely budging at that. Out across northern parts of southeast tonight, a few showers, maybe a storm or two around the Wrangell-St. Elias, and then northward. Most of that, again, will be on the northern side of the ridges there. Otherwise, a really dry night for places along the Yukon Valley, especially the upper part of the valley, the Tanana Valley southward into the Kuskokwim Delta and the Alaska Range, as well as Kodiak Island. South of that, we've got a pretty decent area of low pressure that's spinning some light moisture around it. Other than that, it's really not much to write home about because of all that dry air wrapping around it. High pressure will maintain some showers close to the coastline, probably in the eastern side of Prince William Sound, and again, maybe a chance for a shower or a storm around the Chugach or perhaps the Talkeetnas or the Kenai Mountains. Out across the west, high pressure will also help to keep a steady stream of showers working across the central Aleutians into the eastern parts of Siberia, and some light rain possible across the northern parts of the Yukon Delta into the Norton Sound region and eventually into the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue Sound. Now keep your eye on the north. We've got a trough of low pressure there on the Chukchi Seacoast. It's slowly working its way southward. We've also have warm air developing that's moving northward out of the interior. Probably won't be a whole lot to write home about if you're across the Arctic coast. However, as this is slowly organizing, it's going to work a little bit better to create a leading edge of colder air dropping down behind it. So I suspect that we'll start to see a better chance for more of a north and westerly wind as we get into Thursday and Friday for the Chukchi Seacoast, Kotzebue Sound, and the Seward Peninsula, with high pressure sitting just to the north of the Pribilofs there. Expect some areas of rain across the coastal sections of the west, and probably not as far south as the Kuskokwim Delta, but it's getting there if that drops a little bit further south. Spotty showers and storms across the region for tomorrow. Most of that will be along the mountains and hillsides. Otherwise, the interior and the lower terrain probably looking at a pretty dry day. Maybe a few more clouds than what you saw today. High pressure sitting across the northern Gulf should keep things fairly quiet for southeast, if not mostly sunny in many areas. Low pressure still lurking in the Gulf, but it's mostly a non-player right now thanks to the drier air surrounding it. And there's our low pressure friend way out across the North Pacific, really not going anywhere fast thanks to the overall blocking pattern. By Friday, we see that trying to take on another round of kind of an occlusion front, trying to get started with that. It really doesn't show much sign of progressing forward at all. But up north, that's a little bit of a different pattern there. Suddenly, we've got colder air attached to that low pressure wave that we saw organizing some warmer air. The warmer air and that leading edge of that seems to fall apart. But suddenly, we have a northwesterly flow making its way into the Brooks Range, and with that comes a better chance for lift and probably a better chance for clouds and certainly some showers across the interior and now the west coast all the way down into Bristol Bay. And with that front comes that added boost of lift and probably an opportunity for some more showers and convection across the Seward Peninsula. So there's an opportunity for some thunderstorms there. Also across the eastern Alaska Range and just south of the Yukon Valley, probably over the upper Tanana Valley. With high pressure across the northern Gulf, we still have a drier northwesterly flow for southeastern Alaska, and we still have our friend lurking in the Gulf of Alaska there. That low pressure wave has not gone anywhere. Temperature-wise then, readings back in the 50s and 60s for southeast today. You can see most areas in southern Alaska were not quite on hot, but maybe on slow bake. Probably low to mid 60s for Prince William Sound, 71 in Anchorage. Looks like Kenai, Homer, Seward, all in the lower to mid 60s. Kodiak was 62, Middleton Island 61. As you got into the interior, the temperatures there in the Tanana Valley warmed up nicely into the low to mid 70s today. Healy was 68, 65 in Greeley, 64 in Eagle, and 66 in Northway, with Glen Allen showing 67. Fort Yukon made it up to 63 degrees with Arctic Village at 57. Even Anaktuvik Pass made it into the 60s, with Ambler and Bettles also in the mid to upper 60s, almost 70 in Bettles in fact. 40s and 50s for the Arctic coast, with Barrow jumping up to 48 degrees. Now that is probably pretty warm. And 57 in Wainwright, with 55 around Kivalina, 61 in Shishmaref, and 57 in Nome, with Norton Sound temperatures back in the 50s and 60s. Ruby and Galena both in the 70s today. McGrath was 74. Southwestern coastal temperatures in the 50s and 60s. Hooper Bay a little bit further north was 66. Gamble was 52. The Pribilofs in the lower 50s. Now that is hot. 75 for Dillingham and King Salmon. Now take a look at Cold Bay. See temperatures there in the 60s. Well, earlier this afternoon that temperature tapped 67 degrees. I believe that's as warm as it got. We'll know for sure after midnight. but that is a new record high temperature. So once again this summer, Cold Bay, you can be dubbed Warm Bay, but maybe just for one more day. 52 in Unalaska, and low 50s for the Pribilofs again, and 50s and 60s as you look out toward the central and western chain. Overnight lows back in the 50s around Bristol Bay, about 50 degrees there for King Salmon, 47 in Nunivak Island, a few degrees milder in Nome, 37 in Barrow, and as you look across the east, there's certainly some colder air there. It looks like Eagle could drop down to about 28 tonight. In the interior, though, it's quickly easier to find some much warmer weather thanks to clouds and the wind shifting around a little bit. Low temperatures will likely fall into the mid-50s, lower 50s for a good part of south central, 52 in Kodiak, and 40s and 50s for southeast, with high temperatures tomorrow back in the mid to upper 60s. So the heat is on for southeastern Alaska with a little more sunshine for you. 60s and 70s for south central Prince William Sound, in the mid-60s. Same goes for Kodiak Island. High temperatures in the interior tomorrow. Will it be 80 degrees in Fairbanks? What's it worth? About 77 in Fairbanks. It's getting there. 66 in Arctic Village, 67 in Anaktuvuk Pass. Even the Arctic coast could be warm in the low to mid 50s. Boy, it's going to be a hot day in Wainwright at 57, Kaktovik 42, 54 in Nome, and low 60s around Bethel. I'm sorry, upper 60s, that is 68 degrees, that is not low, and 68 around Dillingham, King Salmon at 71, 50s and 60s for the Alaska Peninsula, the Chain, and the Pribilof, still in the mid-50s. So again, another warm day for you. Out across the Bering and the Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, all the way down to the Yukon Delta. Looks like IFR conditions there by the afternoon. And along that leading edge of that occlusion, you'll see across the central chain there some IFR conditions. MVFR moves off of southeastern Alaska. We find a little bit wider area of MVFR across the Beaufort Seacoast and the Chukchi Seacoast back in it. For pass conditions, then, we expect VFR for Adigan and Anaktuvuk Pass tomorrow. For Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, things should be clear. Rainy Pass, we expect VFR and good sailing and smooth and clear skies there for Windy Pass. VFR conditions also expected in Isabel Pass for your Thursday. Mentasta Pass looks to be okay. Teneda Pass, we're calling VFR for your Thursday. Same goes for Portage Pass, and Chilkoot and White Pass should be clear by tomorrow. Freezing levels show that cold air dropping into the Yukon and northwestern territories. Meanwhile, hotter air is rebuilding in the upper atmosphere, anywhere from 10 to 12,000 feet for the freezing levels across the Chukchi Seacoast. But notice that surface freezing line undercutting that warming there. So a little bit of a change is coming. And for the Gulf of Alaska, those freezing lines anywhere from 8 to 10,000 feet. So a lot of warm air aloft over parts of Alaska. That's one reason that's inhibiting some of that thunderstorm growth tonight and again tomorrow. Below 15,000 but above 10,000, you could run into some light icing potential, but obviously you're going to have to go way up there to find any of that light rime. And above 14,000 feet for the central chain. Otherwise, looks pretty good as far as icing potential goes. The jet stream continues to show our omega blocking pattern that has high pressure across the Pacific Northwest and low pressure across the Gulf of Alaska and mainland Alaska, with high pressure just to the west that has the entire upper level atmosphere across the North Pacific and across Alaska and eastern Siberia and western Canada locked up. There's just no room to move there until one of these systems gets a little bit stronger and can nudge out of the way. The other one will find some wiggle room and things will be off to the races. But for right now, we're still there. One thing that is going to change the pattern just a little bit, though, we're going to keep an eye on this. Remember that surface cold air that we saw dropping into the northwest? Well, that's what's doing it, is that Arctic jet stream there at 80 knots coming in from the north and west. So we're going to keep an eye on that. In the meantime, at 9,000 feet, really not much change from the last few days. Southeasterlies coming up the southeastern coast. Light winds in the interior, as strong as 20 knots coming into Kotzebue Sound from the west. High pressure also across the Bering Sea at 10 to about 20 knots. And light winds coming from north or south across the Aleutians. At 3,000 feet, a westerly flow across the Arctic coast. The interior winds around 15 to 20 knots, generally from a westerly position. More of an easterly flow across the Gulf of Alaska, and very light winds across southeastern Alaska, with high pressure sitting about between the Pribilofs and Nunivak Island. Turbulence potential then looks pretty small. There may be some light chop across the Beaufort Seacoast, generally below 2,000 feet. Also from St. Lawrence Island into Norton Sound and the southern side of the Seward Peninsula to just about Kivalina and Kotzebue. Again, below 4,000 feet there, and also just north of the central and western chain below 4,000 feet and wrapping around our low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska. Other than that, looks like a pretty nice day to fly. We'll take a look at your marine weather forecast and, of course, the latest ice edge analysis here in just a few minutes. Stay with us.
Over the past few decades, the helicopter aeromedical industry has proven itself to be a very effective means of saving the lives of those who are critically ill or injured. However, during the relatively short life of our industry, far too many aeromedical programs, its crews, and sometimes its patients have fallen to tragic accidents. And the highest percentage of these crashes have been caused by human error. Now, often this fact leads us to ask the question, what was the pilot thinking? Why did he act the way he did? And what's even more confusing is why are the same mistakes still being made over and over again throughout our industry? As you go through this training and watch the scenarios, we suggest that you heavily concentrate on the error chain depicted in each scenario and how these steps ultimately lead to a crash. Ask yourself, what were the contributing factors? Were there opportunities to break this chain? Was there a specific culture in a program that affected the pilot's decision-making? And finally, were there direct and/or indirect pressures that influenced the pilot's decision? And finally, before we begin with the scenarios, there are two major points to note. First, none of these scenarios are contrived. Each contain multiple contributing factors and influences taken directly from industry accident and incident reports, as well as confidential surveys recently completed by your peers concerning practices and safety problems within our industry. And second, this video would not be possible if it were not for the support of aeromedical helicopter operators, hospital programs, and their crews, as well as all of the other supporting agencies named in the closing credits of this video. These companies donated their equipment, personnel, and the display of their logos to demonstrate unsafe safety practices in the sincere hope that taking a proactive approach through this training will help to significantly improve the safety record of this worthwhile industry. Tim is an experienced aeromedical pilot. His VFR program works him on a 7-on, 7-off schedule, alternating each tour with days or nights. He was currently on his 6th night of a 7-night tour. This was a particularly long week with no flying due to lack of requests or marginal weather forcing the flights to be turned down. This didn't bother Tim too much since he wasn't in the flying mood. However, the lack of activity was taking its toll on the medical crew. By this point in the tour of nights, they were bored, restless, and tired of having to do make-work projects. In spite of the inactivity, Tim still didn't get much sleep during his nights on duty. He was concerned about his financial situation, which was strained due to a new home he and his wife were having constructed. In an attempt to alleviate some of his money concerns, he was working a second job during his off weeks and when he was on nights. Most of the work was for a friend of his who owned a fly fishing retail store. Tim was making good use of his outdoor skills and knowledge in retail sales by performing many functions at the store. He had worked there on this day up until it was time to leave to report for his duty shift at the hospital. The call came in at dusk for an inter-hospital transfer back to Tim's program base. The weather check revealed that the conditions were at best marginal VFR, with scattered rain showers and thunderstorms in the forecast. The weather was legal, but questionable. Additionally, the weather information at the location of the referring hospital was minimal. The doctor at the referring hospital was becoming concerned as to why it was taking so long for the helicopter service to decide whether they would be coming for the patient. He was a privately rated pilot and decided that the conditions were acceptable and phoned the helicopter pilot directly to advise him of this, and that this patient was in serious need of services they could not provide. Tim briefed the medical crew, and they suggested just having a look and turning back if it wasn't good. Tim decided to give it a try, and the helicopter and crew departed for the referring hospital. The weather didn't change, but it was not good. The workload was high, and Tim was continuously deviating around the rain showers. Upon arrival at the referring hospital, the weather was a little worse, but he found the hospital pad and landed without incident. While the medical crew was packaging the patient, Tim became increasingly concerned about the weather. When the medical crew came out with the patient, it was obvious to Tim that they were going to have their hands full. The referring hospital had waited until the very last minute before they called for more advanced help. Additionally, Tim realized that the patient was a very close friend of his. They loaded the patient, and Tim started the helicopter and departed. The workload remained high, and more deviations were required. The medical crew were oblivious to the conditions. Their hands were too full with the patient, whose condition was worsening. Now Tim has a new concern: fuel. All the deviating has taken its share of his normal fuel, and he is unsure of his ability to safely make it back to his hospital without seriously compromising his fuel reserves, and there were no airports along the way to obtain fuel. Uncomfortable with the fact that he might land back at his hospital with only 10 to 15 minutes of fuel remaining, he is considering diverting to a nearby community hospital with a helipad. This would require the patient to have to complete the trip by ground. However, he was also concerned about the criticality of this patient and the urgent need to get to his hospital. Tim elected to continue on to the medical center.
Here's a look at today's sea ice edge analysis. As always, you can find this on our website at weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. You'll notice a little more melting going on between Wainwright and now north and east of Barrow, so some improvements there if you're looking for a way through. We're still looking at some lower ice concentrations north of Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse and east of Barrow, as the wind patterns are generally from east to west in this case, but the melting is occurring from west to southwest. All this available for you online anytime at our website above. As you look at southeast, look for the winds to blow mainly around the control of high pressure right now. It's sitting just to the north and northwest of southeastern Alaska. That gives you that northwesterly flow, 10 to 15 knots through the inner waterways. Seas should be small, about 2 to 3 feet, and look for seas around 3 to 4 feet across coastal areas with winds there around 10 to 15 knots. For Friday, a little bit more of a west to easterly shift there coming into Gustavus and Sitka and Yakutat. Winds still light, 10 to 15 knots, more of an onshore flow into the Dixon entrance, also with a light wind and small seas. Winds move around a little bit across the inner waterways as they're wont to do. More of a northerly flow around Frederick Sound and Stevens Passage. A southerly wind returns to the Lynn Canals, and more of a northwesterly flow across the Clarence Strait, 15 knots with a 3-foot sea. For south central, look for light and variable winds inside and outside of Prince William Sound and across the north and western Gulf. Easterlies coming into the Barren Islands at 15 knots. Expect 5-foot seas with that. More of a northeasterly flow around the eastern side of Kodiak Island and also through Shelikof Strait with a 4-foot sea. Southwesterlies will continue up the Cook Inlet at 20 knots with a 5-foot sea on Thursday. That becomes a little more southerly, but will maintain 20 knots as we go through Friday. An east and southeasterly wind continues at 50 knots over the Barren Islands, and look for light and variable winds still inside of Prince William Sound and the north and western Gulf and around Resurrection Bay. Here a look at the Alaska Peninsula now. More of a southeasterly flow inside of Bristol Bay, 15 knots with a 2-foot sea. Northeasterlies continue south of Kodiak Island all the way through the Pacific coast of the Alaska Peninsula. Down at King Cove, you're looking at about 15 knots with a 4-foot sea, 10 knots on a variable wind north of Cold Bay with a 3-foot sea. And by Friday, we see north and westerly winds starting to pick up ever so slightly. Small seas inside of Bristol Bay, and northeasterlies continue on the Pacific side at 20 knots with seas around 5 to 7 feet. More of a southeasterly flow for the central and eastern chain, 15 to 20 knots there. Southeasterlies also across the western and central part of the chain with a 7-foot sea. North of Unalaska and Dutch Harbor and Nikolsky, that's a variable wind, light at 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. And as we get into Friday, expect that to become a little more northerly with a 3-foot sea, still light and variable winds on the south side. For the central and western chain, you're looking at more of an east and southeasterly wind out across Attu. That's 15 knots with a 5-foot sea. And north of Adak and Atka, that could be up to 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Otherwise, 4 to 5-foot seas. For the eastern chain, 7-foot seas south of the central Aleutians with that 20-knot wind. Across the west, a south and westerly wind feeding warmer air into the central and northwestern part of Alaska. Along the coast, look for 3 to 5-foot seas there from St. Lawrence Island to St. Matthew and north of Nunivak Island. Northwesterlies around the Kuskokwim Delta, northeasterlies around the Pribilofs with a 2-foot sea. As we go into Friday, that becomes light and variable. Northwesterlies develop around Hooper Bay down to the Kuskokwim Bay, about 15 to 20 knots, 3 to 4-foot seas there. And westerly winds across St. Lawrence Island and the St. Matthew Island waters could bring 4-foot seas through the region. Across the Arctic coast, look for those easterlies to continue for the Beaufort Seacoast, 2 to 3-foot seas. Otherwise, a southerly flow from Kotzebue Sound to areas just north of Barrow, about 20 knots. As we get into Friday, a stronger westerly shift setting the stage for some of that colder air to move ashore. Look for 10, 15, even 20-knot winds there coming across Barrow and southerlies north of Kaktovik with a 2-foot sea. Here's a recap of what's going on around Alaska tonight. Expect some showers across the northern parts of southeast, the Wrangell-St. Elias region, and into parts of Prince William Sound and the eastern sections of the Kenai Peninsula. We have a low in the Gulf, but high pressure will win the day and the night for that matter for most of southeastern Alaska. A wave of light rain will move in from the northern Bering Sea. That should move into places like Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula. Even Kotzebue Sound could get a taste of that. A few showers could pop up across the Brooks Range, and we will watch for an isolated shower or storm around the Kenais, the Chugach, and the Talkeetna Mountains tonight. Out across the west, for the western chain, low pressure is trying to organize. There's really not a big push behind it because the upper level weather pattern is not supporting big storms moving off the Pacific and into the Alaska waters anytime soon. High pressure sitting across the northern Gulf should make for a beautiful day in southeast tomorrow. Some pop-up showers, maybe a storm across south central thanks to the heating of the day, and low pressure working its way off the Brooks Range will make way for colder air by Friday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.